The world and environment have always been one of my favorite parts of video games. How different details and elements within the space can contribute to and shape the overall experience. Whether through visuals that enhance the spectacle of the game, environments that immerse you through things like sound, weather, and intricate details, or environmental storytelling that rewards attention while breathing life into the world. Each of these aspects fascinates me and builds on one another to create something that is truly special and memorable. At the start of this year, I began to learn game development after feeling unfulfilled with my path in life. In the past few months, I've been learning Unreal Engine 5 and Blender, while working on game projects and playtesting, game design, level design, modeling, and environment art roles. As I learned more about modeling and building environments, I became interested in learning the environment art pipeline. I wanted to understand how assets, textures, and materials were created, along with professional tools commonly used in these pipelines. This was to figure out if it was something I might be interested in specializing in, or to have the knowledge to understand the discipline for collaboration with environment artists or solo work where I'd have to do it myself. In the environments I've created so far, nearly all the models, materials, and textures came from existing asset libraries either found online or on the Fab store. My work was mainly putting them together into a cohesive scene, but I wanted to learn about what leads up to that final point. To learn this, I wanted to make my own environment art project with a manageable scope, a simple outdoor nature landscape. This landscape would have ground terrain with grass, flowers, and trees, with each different element allowing me to explore a different part of the pipeline and workflow. Join my journey and watch how I built this. I learned so much, and I'm so excited to share this with you all. So, the first step in making this environment is a landscape terrain. If you're planting trees, flowers, and grass, it has to be on something. So I created a landscape using the landscape tool in Unreal. And then I needed to paint it with a landscape material. In my previous Unreal landscapes, I had used free landscape materials from the Fab store. And I found these to get quite repetitive. So I wanted to mix up the landscape with different colors for variation, and also I wanted to learn the process in making my own landscape materials. So I used this guide from Fast Track Tutorials in helping learn this and setting it up. So basically here's how I did it. I created two RBTs for the base color and height of the landscape, and then I created a master material that could hook up to the RBTs, and then I made a landscape layer blend with color parameters. These would get plugged into the layer blend, and then that would allow me to adjust the base color of the different layers. These layers could be used to paint onto the landscape when I used the tool, the painting tool. This was where I started to realize the power and purpose of material instances and parameters. I had heard about the usage of material instances for previous projects, but actually making them myself and learning some of the process makes me realize just how much they allow for more adjustability and optimization. I mentioned earlier how the landscape material was a master material. Basically, this is a material that serves as the parent, like a base for other materials. I can then create a material instance of that master material. It will keep the base properties of everything I created for it, but then everything that I turn into parameter can be adjusted and tweaked, and it updates in real time. I'll show this off a lot more later as I use it for basically every material and object in this project, but being able to tweak all of the colors or moving a certain variation or moving a wind thing on a whim and being able to make duplicates of that to have multiple different versions that pulled from a master material really helped with my workflow so that I wouldn't have to make small tweaks and have to load each time. Anyways, now that I had my landscape material instance, I could start to paint the landscape. To allow for more natural color variation in painting the landscape, and to make use of all the layers I had made for my blend, I followed that YouTube guide I mentioned earlier to Substance Designer, where I created this noise map texture that I could use as an alpha brush when I was painting with my different layers that would add variations to the terrain. Basically, the alpha brush was like a variation of black and white grayscale colors that would have more natural brush, so I wouldn't just be painting like a solid brush on everything, from what I understand. And like that, my landscape was done, at least the colors and it being down. So now it was time to put grass onto the landscape. So here's where we got into some modeling. Modeling this grass was a bit of a learning curve because I decided to switch the 3D modeling tool I was using for this. I decided to transition from Blender to learning Maya. So here's how I modeled the grass. The first thing I did was importing the Unreal Mannequin into Maya so that I could use it as a scale so I can make sure that my grass wasn't too large or too small. And then I created a plane. This would act as my grass blade. I gave the plane loop cuts. This was to give me more vertices and edges to have control over the blade. I merged 2 vertices at the top to give it like a sharp triangular grass look. I then used proportional editing and moved parts of the blade to add more natural rotation like a grass blade instead of it just being like straight up. The loop cuts allowed me to have more control over the bend, as the proportional editing that's where like the bending points could happen, is at those cuts. After making a singular standing grass blade by rotating it and all that, I made duplicates of that grass blade and gave them various rotation and scale to have a nice patch of grass. I then realigned the normals to be facing up so that the lighting would be even, and UV maps the individual blades so that the base of the grass, they would be aligned at the bottom together. I combined all of the blades into a singular mesh and exported my combined grass patch as an FBX, and it was ready to be imported into the engine. I used the same video tutorial from earlier for the rest of the grass setup, for like the material and all that. I created a master material for the grass. Here I added my RVT base color and height information from earlier, so that instead of manually assigning the grass material a base color that would give the grass color, from what I understand, the color from the ground would give the information to the RVT, which would give the ground color to the base color. So basically, the ground color would become my grass base color. This added some nice color variation, as I had all my ground colors different from my noises. And this also made it that if I wanted to tweak the ground color, I wouldn't have to tweak the grass color as well. It would all change together. Another standout on this material as well was adding a simple grass wind node to the world offset on the grass material to add some wind movement to the grass, so it was moving, it had like an animation. To accompany this, I also followed the guide from earlier to create a wind noise texture in Substance Designer. This texture would then get added with a panner that attached to a lerp node with the base color. This would basically have the texture I made pan across the base color and change the color, and this made it look like there was gusts of wind by just using it color by making it darker, like the shadow would move if the grass got moved by wind. I also disabled the cast shadow as well, as I felt like this grass, at least as stylized grass, looked a lot nicer without shadow. It looked more stylized and fluffy. I felt very good about this grass, and I was very happy that I was like making progress and actually learning these programs like Maya and Substance Designer and learning why these nodes were doing what. So I decided to move on to making trees. For the trees, I had previously used Blender and messed around with the Sapling Tree Gen plugin to automatically generate trees, like randomized trees. But since I was transitioning to Maya, I wanted to learn how to make a tree to get adjusted to this new program. I'd like to give a massive shout out to this video, as it gave a really good introduction into making stylized trees in Maya and Unreal Engine. I followed most of this tutorial for the making of the trees in this project, so I highly recommend checking the video out. So to start, I used one of the curved spline tools to sculpt a line that looked like a branch or a trunk of the tree. I could then convert this spline into a polygon and give it geometry and shape instead of just being a line. I also had it taper off near the end to look more natural. After mapping the UVs, I made duplicates of the rough tree shape and shrunk them to add branching points around the tree. My tree shape from here was now done, but I was still missing something very important, which was the leaves. This was where a big journey started, like a lot of research. It was quite difficult to find out how to properly add leaves onto 3D trees. I did a lot of research into foliage for video games, and from what I found is that a lot of game trees place a bunch of flat 2D planes to block out the shape of the leaves. They don't actually individually model each leaf or branch. Instead, these planes get applied with a material that uses a masked leaf card texture, which is basically a photo of some leaves. This photo is then masked so that the background around the leaves is transparent, and it gives the look of many little leaves cut out. Some games also use rotating billboards that make these leaves constantly face towards the player camera. This is to prevent the player from looking at the leaves from a side and realizing that it's just a flat plane and breaking the illusion. Trees are not alone in using this method for foliage. It seems that it's fairly common in things like grass, flowers, and bushes. So why is foliage done this way? I don't want to give a definitive answer as I'm still learning, so don't quote me on this. But from what I understand, one of the primary reasons is optimization. If you're placing foliage in a video game, odds are you're placing a lot of it, since normally if you go into some sort of nature landscape, there's lots of grass. There's not just one piece of grass there. So individually modeling every little leaf and little branch would add up to a lot of like vertices and edges and triangles, which makes it expensive to render. Add on top of that with the high amount of foliage, as I stated from earlier, it'll add up and it comes quite expensive. So your foliage, you want it to not be expensive. So that's where this masked foliage technique comes in, because this flat 2D plane can display like 20 leaves or a whole thing of grass with just 4 vertices and a single face. It is worth noting though that some newer games are starting to move away from this and actually individually modeling like every tree, every leaf and grass, especially with newer technologies like nanite in Unreal Engine. I don't really know how nanite works, but from what I know, if you use nanite, you can't really use this technique of masked planes because it leads to a lot of overdraw. I personally wasn't using nanite despite using Unreal Engine, so I decided to go with using the mask technique, also just so I could learn how this was to be done. In retrospect, I probably should have done the same technique for the grass, made a flat plane with like a grass drawing, and then stacked a bunch of those planes on top of each other to make my grass, so it wouldn't be as expensive with each grass blade being its own thing. But I think it was good to do as an introduction because that was like my first Maya model. Also, that grass could be used as nanite foliage from what I know, so I guess it's just something to keep in mind in the future and just have those skills and knowledge. So I needed to make the leaves. In Photoshop, I painted this simple leaf card texture to put onto a material. And then in Maya, I made a bunch of 2D planes that were like rotated and intersecting with each other. And I placed them to form the shape of a tree canopy on the tree trunk and branches I built. From here, I then combined the leaves and assigned them to a material that was separate from the trunk material and then combined the two. This was so that when I exported my tree and imported them into Unreal Engine, the two parts of the tree could be assigned to their own respective material so that I wouldn't assign a bark texture to my leaves or assign a leaves texture to my trunk and having it all be broken. I then created a master material for the leaves using a masked leaf card hooked up to the opacity and parameters that allowed me to adjust the color and sizing of these leaves, as well as giving the leaves wind, just like I did with the grass using the wind node. Another part of the material setup in the nodes was the usage of transform vector nodes. This was to make it so the billboards of the leaves would face the camera so that it wouldn't break the illusion of the leaves. And it's not very noticeable unless you're like sitting there staring at the leaves as you move your camera very fast. For the trunk material, I continued to follow the tree guide into Substance Designer. This was my first time making like a texture for a material in Substance Designer because the two things I made earlier were just noises and stuff for like masking. It really helped in giving me a good intro experience into the software, making this spark texture. For me, Substance Designer was very similar to the blueprint system in Unreal or like the node editor in Blender. You place down various nodes and then you can like wire them into each other to combine them to get a output that adds the two different nodes. So if I had like a noise node, I could hook that up into a blur node, and then this blur node will now output that noise but have it blurred. And then I can control the noise and the blur. And then once you have the texture you want, you can hook them up into a output for an individual texture map like normal or roughness. And then you can export these outputs and get the respective texture files for the maps. So I followed the guide and I was able to get this stylized bark texture, and then I exported the base color, the ORM, and the normal outputs. Now that I had my textures made, I created a bark or trunk master material. This is where I added my texture inputs with varying parameters that allowed me to control the color and roughness. Along with that, I added a world align blend node with a linear interpolate node. This allowed me to add overlaying color onto the wood. This could be used things for like exposed bark or growing moss or snow on the tree. I then made material instances of these master materials, and I had a nice customizable tree. I then hooked these up into my tree model that I exported. I adjusted the leaves to be like pink, and then for the trunk, I made it brown, and then I added some green overlay on top of it to make it look like there was moss or like nature growing on the tree. And then I also made a version of this tree that was yellow so I could have more colors. I chose the pink and yellow trees so that I could have some differing color to break up from the very green landscape, and also because I found them to be quite pretty. I really like pink trees, and the yellow looked nice as well. With this, I had my trees done, and I learned a lot about foliage. Really cool stuff. This next part is a bit different. For the flowers, I thought it'd be fun to go outside on a little field expedition to study flowers and get some reference flowerhead photos. So let's go outside and go on an adventure. Okay everyone, I'm currently outside walking around. It is 6 a.m. and I just finished driving over to my college campus. Now you may be wondering, why is this guy walking around at 6 a.m. on his college campus? What does this have anything to do with environment art? Well, it's a good question. I thought it would be cool to do like a little field survey, get out there in the real world and look at some foliage, like look at some grass and flowers and see how they grow. So maybe I can take that learning and apply it to my virtual environment. But also I thought it'd be cool to like collect my own like flower samples, like reference photos, so like I can own the process so I don't get like copyright striked for using some dude's flowers on Google, unless like the landscaper here has copyright on the flowers. I'm not sure. Okay, I finally see flowers. I've been walking around for like 10 minutes. Finally see some flowers over there. Okay, the whole entire point of me being out this early was like there wasn't supposed to be a lot of people around. Like, there is a lot of people around. Oh my god, wait. I just found some more flowers. And there's like no one here either. Ooh, okay. Look at these guys. These are kind of cool. They're very high up. I'm not gonna lie. This is a lot harder than I thought it'd be. Not because like it's hard to find plants, but like there's so much people outside at this time. Look at these guys. I mean, I don't know how I'd like model these, but like these are beautiful. Like, one thing I'm realizing is there's lots of different colors. Like if you were to do a flower like asset or like material, you might have it just be the same thing when it's near each other. Like look at these, how they like fade. Like this one over here is like fading, and like right next to each other, they're growing on the same plant. It's all a different color. So I think it'd be really cool to do, especially because I want to make like a colorful like landscape. Like look at these guys. I don't know, the way they're like light, they're not like dark like the grass, but like they kind of seem like translucent in a way. Flowers are probably the most complex part of this whole project, as the process of making them really confused me at first. I started with watching this guide by the same person who did the tree guide on making flowers in Maya and Unreal Engine, and I was very stumped. In the tutorial, the person basically drew an image in Photoshop of flower heads, petals, and a gradient. I didn't know why they were doing this as opposed to sculpting the flower head and mapping a material or using a plane and just drawing out the whole flower like the masked foliage. I did some extra research into the making of stylized scenes and found this very detailed ArtStation page. It was a very detailed breakdown of this scene called Village in the Clouds. He gave a great look into the creation of all the aspects of his environment, and he had a section for foliage where he used things called atlases. These atlases are, from what I understand, a singular texture image that contain multiple things that you can use to map different materials or different objects. So basically, this singular texture file could cover the creation of multiple flowers, petals, and the gradient could be UV mapped for the stem. I also realized that the usage of this technique was very similar to the leaf cards, in that the flowers and petals would be masked. So I made a peer ref project and put a bunch of images for my field study to look at. I really liked the purple and yellow flowers, and I also liked the blue and pink flowers, like the color of them. I also really liked these standing purple plants. I didn't know exactly what these were. I don't know if they're flowers or whatever, but I like them. So in Photoshop, I drew and combined shapes to make flower heads for these 4 flowers. They aren't exact recreations of the flower images, but I think that helps with the stylized look. I then made a oval shaped petal and a gradient that could be UV mapped later to the stem. From Photoshop, I then exported 2 pictures to be used as my maps. I exported the base color texture, which was what I had drawn with color, and then I also exported a alpha texture that was black and white. This would be used to mask. With the Alice textures, I created a plane in Maya and assigned it with a material with the base color texture and a transparency mask with the alpha texture. From here, I used the cut tool and I cut out all the pieces to be separated into their own objects. To make the flowers not just a flat image, I made an X down the center of the vertices with the cutting tool, and then this would add a extra vertice in the middle that I could pull down to give a blooming flower shape. I then created a very tall and skinny cube that would act as my stem. I deleted the top and bottom faces since they wouldn't be seen, just to do some optimization for performance. I could then UV map the remaining faces of the stem onto the gradient from my Alice texture to give the stem color. And then I duplicated my flower heads I had made and petals to then add them to the stem to create a flower. And then in Unreal, I made a flower material. I used my base color texture from Photoshop as the base color. I just hooked it up. And then I used the alpha texture to be hooked up into the opacity mask to cut out the pieces. I then also added a simple grass wind node like my previous footage to just add wind movements to the flowers. When I imported my flowers into the engine, I realized it was very hard to create natural looking flower bunches or patches. So I decided to create bunches of flowers in Maya and then combine them into a single flower patch mesh. Now I wanted to make the standing purple plant, so I started by duplicating the stem and then making it much taller. And then from here, I just made duplicates of the purple flower head and the vertice, the middle vertice that I used to give it the blooming shape. I just pulled it up instead of down so that the flower would now be facing down. And then I made a bunch of duplicates of these new flower heads and increased the size slightly as they went down on the stem, as they looked like in the reference plant. Then I added a bunch of petals that were just different size and rotations on the stem. And then I formed this standing purple plant, which I thought looked really nice. And for the most part, that was my flowers. As I started to spread them out onto the terrain, I'm not gonna lie, I started to feel very happy and proud with the progress I made so far, as it just started to come together with the trees and the grass. And I felt like I was actually learning these tools. I was learning Maya. I was getting an idea of why certain nodes are being used in the blueprint editor. I was making use of different techniques and different new applications like Substance Designer. I was planning on calling it with the flowers, and those would be the last assets so that I could start to make my whole scene. But I decided to challenge myself with making one more asset. In my first ever environment art project, I had a problem with my terrain looking bad. It just looked smooth, too smooth. There was a lack of breaking up in depth. Any attempt at making mountains or hills, just sloped terrain looked odd. This led me to play and study the game with my favorite environment and world, Skyrim. I did some exploring, and from what I saw, a lot of the variation in the landscape and the mountains themselves are made up of physical rock assets instead of sculpted landscape. So I experimented with laying rocks around on hills, sloped terrain, and then upscaling rocks for mountains. And this just added so much to my scene. Look at this. Later, I used the same scaled rocks as distance mountains with height fog. And this gave the illusion of the world continuing the distance instead of just being in this little square landscape and magically ending. So I decided to challenge myself and make some rocks for this project, just to add environmental depth, but also to add color variation since everything so far was very saturated and colorful, and I kind of wanted to add some gray rockish elements. This is a part of the project that I'm probably most proud of since I had made the rock mesh in Maya by myself from what I had learned so far. I made a square in Maya and added some subdivisions to the square. This allowed me to take individual parts of these square faces and move them. I utilized the proportional editing tool in Maya, which allowed the faces and edges and all that around the selected object to move with it, which gave a nice natural extrusion in the sides. So I just kept moving and pulling things until I made a rough rock shape. From here, I used the retopology tool to add more faces and details to the rock shape I sculpted. From here, this is where I did start to follow this stylized rock guide. It was meant for Blender using like Voronoi modifiers, but since I already had my rock made in Maya, I just skipped to the part where he did a substance designer material. So I needed to make two separate meshes, a less detailed low poly rock and a more detailed high poly rock. So with the retopology tool from earlier, I made a low poly rock with 2,000 faces and a high poly rock with 8,000. When I was learning this technique, making low poly and high poly meshes, I was confused onto why it was being done, and now I realized it's done for baking purposes, where from what I understand, you can take the maps, like the normal maps, the roughness, the ambient occlusion of the high poly object and apply those onto a lower poly object. This allows you to add the extra detail and lighting and all that forms from high poly maps onto something that is lower poly and less expensive to render. In my case, after doing some UV unwrapping, I was able to export my low poly and high poly rocks into Adobe Substance Painter and bake the high poly maps onto my low poly rock. And this added a lot more detail, like it looked a lot more sharp despite only being 2,000 faces. So now that I had my model and had it done baking and had the maps, I continued to follow the guide to make the rock material. This was my first time using Substance Painter, but I found a lot of similarities to graphic design or Photoshop work I had done in the past. You can do things like painting, and you have different layers with varying settings you can tweak, like saturation or levels. For this guide I followed, they mostly just used fill layers with different filters and settings to add a rock texture. Then in Substance Designer, following the guide, I made a moss texture that could be used with a linear interpolate node to add overgrowth texture on the rocks if I wanted to have some sort of moss growing on it. So I exported these textures out of Substance Painter and Substance Designer, and I made a rock master material. After the rocks, basically all my assets and everything was done and ready. I had a landscape material and brush, along with grass, flowers, trees, and now rocks that just needed to be put onto terrain. So now I just needed to put the final environment art piece together using my stuff. I was thinking about doing a voiceover for this part, but I thought it'd be better for me to record this live and give you all a walkthrough of the environment I made and explain my thought process a little bit and show like the specific parts I'm talking about. So the first thing I kind of want to go over was like the story of this. So this is the final result. I think I'm quite happy with this. So my idea with making this landscape was that it would be small, it wouldn't be giant and vast, but I still wanted to have some sort of scale with like mountains and all of that because I thought that would be cool. My story was that this location would be like a secluded nature area found on like a mountain, like hiking or like just somewhere deep within the mountains or hidden off. I've gone on hiking trails before where there's like some sort of waterfall near the end or some like beautiful landscape with like trees, but it's really like you go up the mountains and then you have to go down because it's surrounded by mountains. You can't reach it normally. So that was my idea with making this, right? It's completely surrounded and the only way to get in would be through here, which yes, it leads nowhere, but you know, with some clever screenshots, people can't tell. I just found the idea cool that you could be wandering and come across this just haven that was sheltered off from the world, and due to it being surrounded, it's just been left to do its own thing. But you came across it, or travelers may make the trek through all this terrain just to behold the sights of the area. So in order to do that, basically I would use the landscape tool over here. And from here, basically what I did was just sculpt the landscape up. So if I was to like do this, right, it'd start to sculpt up. The reason this is black is because I'd have to set the RVTs because there's the height RVTs. Yeah, you can actually see me. I have it open over there. I just went through, drew all over, and just lifted the height up on the edges. so that the terrain would slope up, which would have this little divot so that this was an area that you'd like come across. I would then use the smooth tool to just smooth it out to have more natural like bumps and stuff like that instead of it just being really high up. Like, because see, if I wasn't to smooth it, like you'd see it just kind of just start to do its own thing. Along with that too, with the landscape, I use the rock assets that I made, and these are just scaled up rock assets, and this is the idea that these are the mountains that surround this area. I also use the rocks to put them on the edges of hills or slope terrain, so that wasn't just flat green the whole entire time. See, I also have some of the smaller ones. They're scattered here in the water. They're over here in the middle of the water, and I'll go over that later. This placement. And then basically I just spread the grass across. I kind of showed that earlier. I used some of the foliage tool and I made it so that the grass would be scaled. So yeah, here we go, scale X. So some of it's smaller, some of it's larger, just makes it look more natural. I also did the same with the flowers. I really wanted to spread the flowers across and have a cool variation of flowers. So basically every flower type can be found in these fields. I feel like the flowers added a lot of color, so I kind of just spread them across the green landscape, and it adds a lot of contrast between the dark stone as well. And then the trees I kind of also just dotted across. The flowers as well do vary in height. They do have some clipping with the grass, but I feel like if they're all really high up, it would look weird. So I kind of just had them lower. You can also see the grass, how it's moving, the like wind. I think it adds some nice texture to the grass and kind of gives the idea that there is wind coming here. So one thing I didn't mention earlier was this water. I made this water through that ArtStation page earlier. I wanted to add water after having the idea that it would be like a secluded pond. Like I wanted this to be a highlight when you like would come up, you'd look down and it kind of naturally leads your eye. I don't want to get too far ahead, that's for later. So this is a water material. I just followed the pins that this guy had for all of it, but it kind of has things where the noises are what gives it the waves. You can kind of see some rough waves. And then also there's like foam near the side. You can see like the white, which that will form around any objects that come into the water. It's not the most realistic water, but then again, this isn't the most realistic landscape. I really wanted to capture that cartoonish vibe. The grass, it gets its color from the ground. So I had it so the grounds near the water started to become a little bit more yellowish or brownish, just to have like, the water seeping in or a change in material. So you can kind of see how the edges become a little bit more yellowish or brownish on the grass. Another thing too, which wasn't really an asset I created, but helps contribute to the landscape, was just the overall usage of lighting. This is like the regular tools that come with Unreal, with the directional lights, sky atmosphere, the clouds and all that. I think what I changed was the lights is kind of just above. It gives them the most equal lighting. I also had a post-process volume so that there wasn't any natural eye exposure. The fog, I have that fog in the distance, which helps add that, look that the mountains are like really far off or like faded off, because otherwise it's like that, which they still look distant, but it looks more believable like this. And I also went with a blue fog since it kind of goes with the sky, which with the sky, I kind of just made it like a nice blue. I wanted this to look cartoonish, kind of dreamlike and colorful. So I just went with a nice colorful blue sky, nothing like muted or white. And the clouds too, these are just the basic Unreal clouds. What I did is I played around with the texture that they use for this. And then one thing I changed was the noise strength. So if I reset this to normal, you can see that starts to look like real clouds. So since I wanted it to be a little bit more cartoonish, I kind of just changed that color so that it was a lot more detailed and kind of just cartoonish cloud. It looks more unrealistic that way. Another thing I didn't mention earlier was the bushes. These are just the tree leaves. I modeled like a smaller canopy and just gave it a different leaf texture, and I have these bushes that are just scattered across. So the main shots I had with this in mind, if we full screen here again, was you had it earlier. I showed you earlier down here. I don't always get the exact placement, but it was here. So this captures a lot of everything, where you see these smaller mountains on the side. They're up front. You have the water body. You have some flowers, scattered flowers. Some of them are abundant, some of them are a little bit smaller. You have these smaller purple flowers. My idea with these is actually, these are kind of, I put them on the edge of the water because they kind of reminded me of like water reeds. So there's like, you have those big, tall plants that are growing out of the water. And the trees, the way I shaped this, I wanted it to lead your eye so that you can see the mountains in the background to give that sense of scale, but then also where people would come from. So the water, you can see this little, it leads over here. And then the placement of the flowers is very abundant, but it goes kind of in this direction. So there's multiple ways you could look at it. You could follow this rock and then these trees and then to go up here, or you could follow the rock to this rock, to this rock. And then there's the flowers that lead you over there. And the same with the trees is that they're here, but they kind of have this clear opening here. You could follow these flowers, these bushes, and these smaller flowers. I made these smaller so you kind of naturally follow it. I feel like if this is more abundant, you might spot this first, and it just leads over there into the distance. One thing too, I realized now I didn't mention with the water was, you ask where would it come from? Since the water, like I can't really have like a natural lake since it would kind of get cut off. And I also didn't make like a waterfall. My idea was that it'd kind of come through somewhere from the mountains. Those like there's like small openings in mountains where they have tunnels that come through and the water kind of comes out from there. So that's kind of what I did from this. So you have this rock here and it places down and the water comes out. The other shot, the idea I had here was this. You can actually see the terrain slopes down. So as I said, you're wandering all these abundant mountains and then, or you're specifically coming across here and then you come here and you're like, there's an opening here. You see all these smaller mountains, the hills, whatever. So you come across this hill, right? And then you see what you journeyed here for, or you see this surprise that you didn't expect to find on your adventure. And you just, you come over and you see this. And again, the placement of the water, you kind of leads here and it goes into the big spectacle down here with the rock in the center. The flowers here aren't as abundant, but they can kind of lead you to where the flowers are more abundant to have this as the highlight. The trees have that opening, but you also see more trees in the distance. And you can still see these farther mountains in the background to give that sense of scale. Oh wow, I move really slowly. So yeah, a big thing was I just wanted to make it smaller, but still have that scale. I wanted to have a story. I wanted it to be colorful. I wanted to think about the placement of things while still, doing some natural nature scattering. Like these up here, a little bit more pink, just because I liked the pink and how it kind of worked the most with the pink trees. But then down here where it's a little bit more loud, I put more flowers. One thing to point out was that since the moss and the rock was tileable and I could adjust it with my parameters, these don't have as much overgrowth on them. They're a little bit more muted, but you can see that these have more green on them. That was so the idea, maybe that's a mountain, maybe there's this landscape somewhere on that so that it's not as just, oh, here's a giant rock in the distance. It kind of has some nature growing on it. I was also thinking about maybe placing trees up there, but I didn't really get to that because it was weird with the scale. So this really was, this is kind of it. I feel like it's not the most grand thing, but I'm really proud of it and I'm happy about the thinking I put into it. And I hope that you find it to be visually appealing or pretty. I learned a lot doing this. I learned how to do some basic modeling in Maya, getting to use a wide array of different tools available in that program. I got to use Substance Painter and Designer for the first time and learn the basics of those tools, along with learning how you can use Photoshop to do modeling. I learned techniques like masking, general texture techniques with atlases, modeling techniques with baking, and setting up materials in the engine and making them optimized, customizable, and scalable. I also just got to think creatively and learn how to build an environment based around a story or idea I had for it. There's a lot more I learned, but those are like the highlights for me. What I would change with my scene or what I could do better? The grass, I feel like I could definitely do better. Since I was using masked techniques, I should have made it billboard masked foliage with intersecting like standing 2D planes of grass drawing instead of individually modeling each grass. Because this current grass I was using in the scene would definitely not be optimized if this was in a game scene. Another thing was the leaves. They are just a flat drawing and stick out for being a little bit too simple with the rest of the style, even if it was cartoonish and stylized. I also think I could have put more thought into making my tree canopies, as some of the leaves stick out awkwardly. So that also leads into things for the future, which would be learning sculpting for this foliage in something like ZBrush. From what I saw, a lot of foliage is sculpted in ZBrush and baked to get those maps, and those maps are used on an image of the sculpted foliage, so that although they still use the masked plane technique, having sculpted the foliage piece and having the maps allows them to still have a lot of detail and style in the foliage, which is something I should definitely learn for this. I also think it would be fun to have animations, like animated models, and learn that in the future. I've seen some stuff where people make small models of bees flying around to place them around trees or flowers. And then also they have things like birds flying in the sky. And I think that would add a lot more to the scene and breathe more life into it. I also think that for the future, I should learn how to make some sort of building or something non-nature-like, making use of tile sheets and learning how to make building kits. So there is still a lot for me to learn, but at least for this project, I'm happy with what I made and I'm excited to work on something next. A big part of this project for me was just discovering if this environment stuff and modeling would be something I would truly enjoy. I really did enjoy a lot. I loved to think about placement, creation of foliage, how colors worked, the composition, storytelling through the environment. Thank you so much for watching this video. This has genuinely been like a multi-month project and I've spent hours alone just editing this video. So I really hope you enjoyed this and I hope you have a great day.